Some names are remembered for power, others become remembered for fear. And in Australia's criminal underworld, few names have carried the weight of both, quite like Barbaro. For decades, the Barbaro name appeared alongside stories of organized crime, gangland violence, and unimaginable family tragedy. It became a name that commanded attention long before Harley Barbaro was ever old enough to choose the life he wanted. But legacies have a way of shaping the people born into them. As Harley grew older, he stepped into Australia's outlaw bikie world, eventually becoming a prominent member of the Mongols motorcycle club. From that moment on, his life unfolded under constant public scrutiny, with courtroom appearances, media headlines, and an ever-growing reputation following him wherever he went. To some, Harley Barbaro was exactly what they expected him to become. To others, he was a man who could never escape the weight of the name he inherited. Then, without warning, the story came to a sudden end. In July 2026, only hours after spending the evening with friends at a boxing event on Queensland's Sunshine Coast, Harley returned to the Gold Coast. By the following morning, he had collapsed at his home and was later pronounced dead. He was just 33 years old. His sudden death shocked family, friends, and many within Australia's bikie community. A life that had spent years making headlines ended in a way few people saw coming. But Harley Barbaro's death is only one part of this story. Because to understand how it ended, you first have to understand how it began. How does someone born into one of Australia's most infamous surnames end up becoming one of the country's most recognized Mongols, bikies? Was Harley shaping his own future, or was he living a life that had been written long before he was born? This isn't just the story of a bikie. It's the story of family legacy, loyalty, reputation, choices, and the price that can come with carrying a name the world already knows. This is the true story of Harley Barbaro. Inside the life and death of the Mongols bikie, every story has a beginning. Harley Barbaro's began long before he ever made a headline, long before he wore the colors of the Mongols, long before courtrooms, media attention, or public controversy. There was simply a surname, Barbaro. Across Australia, it was a name that had become closely associated with organized crime, gangland violence, and decades of tragedy. Over the years, the family had repeatedly found itself in newspaper headlines, making the name instantly recognizable to many Australians. By the time Harley was born, that reputation had already taken on a life of its own. It wasn't something he had created. It wasn't something he could erase. But from the very beginning, it shaped the way many people saw him. Growing up under a surname like Barbaro meant living with expectations few people ever experience. Before Harley had the chance to prove who he was, others had already decided who they believed he would become. Some believed he was destined to follow the same path that had brought so much attention to his family. Others believed every person deserved the chance to choose a different future. Only time would reveal which was true. As Harley grew older, Australia itself was changing. Outlaw motorcycle clubs were becoming more visible. Organized crime groups were evolving. The country's underworld was entering a new era, and for someone carrying a name already known to the public, avoiding attention was never going to be easy. For years, Harley lived beneath a reputation he had inherited, a reputation built by generations before him. But there comes a moment in every life when a person stops carrying someone else's story and begins writing their own. For Harley Barbaro, that moment arrived when he took his first steps into Australia's outlaw bikie world. From there, the story would never be the same. Every life is shaped by a series of choices. For Harley Barbaro, the first would change everything. By the time Harley entered adulthood, Australia's outlaw motorcycle clubs had become a powerful presence within the country's criminal landscape. To most people, they were known through newspaper headlines and television reports. But from the inside, it was a world built on loyalty, discipline, reputation, and an unwritten code that every member was expected to respect. It was into that world that Harley took his first steps. His earliest known association was with the Villains Motorcycle Club, where he began building friendships with people who shared the same lifestyle. It was more than a social circle. It was an environment where trust had to be earned, loyalty was expected, and every decision carried lasting consequences. For Harley, this wasn't simply about motorcycles. It was about belonging. For the first time, people weren't paying attention because of the family name he had inherited. They were paying attention to the man he was becoming. As the years passed, Harley became more deeply connected to the Bikie community. The relationships he built and the reputation he earned gradually opened the door to a far bigger stage. Around 2018, Harley became a member of the Mongols motorcycle club. It was one of the most significant decisions of his life. Joining the Mongols wasn't simply a change of colors. It was the moment Harley stepped into a club already known across Australia for its high profile and public attention. From that day forward, there was no separating Harley Barbaro from the world he had chosen. The surname that had once defined him was no longer the only reason people recognized his name. Now, Harley was creating a reputation of his own. It was a reputation that would bring respect from some, criticism from others, and a level of public attention unlike anything he had experienced before. Without realizing it, Harley had crossed a line that would shape every chapter of his future. The choices he had made were about to be tested, and the consequences would soon unfold before the eyes of the entire country. Southport, Queensland. For Harley Barbaro, walking into a courtroom was no longer an unusual experience. By now, the choice he had made years earlier was beginning to shape every part of his public life. The man who had once lived beneath the weight of the Barbaro name was now creating headlines of his own. With every court appearance, Harley attracted more attention. News cameras waited outside. Newspaper headlines followed. Public opinion grew stronger. To some, he had become another symbol of Australia's outlaw bikie culture. To others, he was a man whose reputation was often judged long before the evidence had been heard. One of Harley's most closely watched legal battles centered on Queensland's habitual consorting laws. Prosecutors alleged that he had repeatedly associated with people listed in an official police warning, arguing that those meetings breached legislation designed to disrupt organized criminal networks. The case attracted significant media attention and was closely followed across Queensland. But when the evidence was tested in court, the outcome surprised many observers. Harley was found not guilty of the habitual consorting charge. It was a reminder that allegations alone were not enough to determine guilt, and that every case would ultimately be decided on the evidence presented before the court. For a brief moment, it seemed the headlines might finally begin to fade. They didn't. Harley's name continued appearing alongside stories involving the Mongols motorcycle club, ensuring he remained a familiar figure in media reports and public discussion. Then, another legal challenge placed him back under the spotlight. In September 2025, Harley again faced a habitual consorting allegation after prosecutors claimed CCTV footage showed him repeatedly associating with another Mongols member. At first, the case appeared difficult to challenge. Then, a single detail changed everything. During the court proceedings, Harley identified that the person shown in the CCTV footage had been incorrectly identified. His legal team disputed the prosecution's claim, arguing the footage did not show the individual investigators believed it did. After reviewing the evidence, prosecutors accepted that the identification could not be relied upon and withdrew the charge. Once again, a case that had generated headlines ended inside a courtroom rather than in the newspapers. Those legal battles only deepened the public divide. Supporters argued they demonstrated why evidence should always be tested before conclusions are reached. Critics believed Harley's repeated appearances in court reflected the world he had chosen to be part of. Whatever opinion people held, one fact had become impossible to ignore. Harley Barbaro was no longer living in the shadow of his family's reputation. He had become one of the most recognizable figures within Australia's modern bikie landscape. But away from the cameras, away from the courtrooms, away from the headlines, there was another side of Harley Barbaro that very few Australians ever saw. And that side of his life would make the final chapter of this story far more tragic than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 4: Behind the Headlines. Headlines rarely tell the whole story. By the time Harley Barbaro had become one of the Gold Coast's most recognized Mongols members, most Australians knew him through courtroom appearances and media reports. But the people closest to him knew a different side. Away from cameras and public attention, Harley shared his life with his long-term partner, Hayley Webb, and was the father of 2 young sons. Family remained an important part of who he was. In 2021, after welcoming one of his boys, Harley chose the name Rosario, a tribute to his late brother. It was a quiet reminder that despite the tough public image, the losses his family had endured were never far away. To the public, Harley Barbaro was a Mongols Bikie. To those who knew him personally, he was a partner, a father, a son, and a friend. It was a side of his life that rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. And like so many ordinary moments shared with family, no one could have known they were quietly becoming some of his last. The next chapter of Harley Barbaro's life wouldn't unfold inside a courtroom. It would unfold over the course of a single weekend that would change everything. The 3rd of July, 2026, Sunshine Coast, Queensland. It began like any other Saturday. There was nothing to suggest that, within hours, Harley Barbaro's story would come to an unexpected end. That evening, Harley attended a boxing event at the Banana Bender Hotel in Palmview, where he spent time with friends and familiar faces from the Bikie community. Witnesses later recalled seeing him laughing, greeting people with hugs and handshakes, and appearing to be in good spirits throughout the night. To everyone there, was simply another night out. No one could have known they were witnessing Harley Barbaro's final public appearance. After the event, Harley returned home to the Gold Coast. By the following morning, everything had changed. Emergency services were called to Harley's Parkwood home after he suddenly collapsed. Despite efforts to save him, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Authorities later confirmed that his death was not being treated as suspicious, with the exact medical cause left to be determined through the coroner's process. Within hours, news of Harley Barbaro's death spread across Australia. For many, the shock wasn't just that he had died, it was how suddenly it had happened. Only the night before, he had been laughing with friends. Now, one of the Gold Coast's most recognizable Mongols members was gone, but Harley Barbaro's story had not yet reached its final chapter. His farewell would soon become one of the most widely discussed Bikie funerals Australia had seen in recent years. The news of Harley Barbaro's death spread quickly, but his final farewell was still to come. In the days that followed, family, friends, and members of Australia's Bikie community travelled to Melaleuca Station Memorial Gardens, near the New South Wales-Queensland border, to say goodbye. It wasn't an ordinary funeral. It was the final ride of a man whose life had rarely escaped public attention. Rows of motorcycles lined the entrance as mourners gathered throughout the morning. Among them were members and associates of the Mongols Motorcycle Club, standing alongside family and close friends for one last farewell. At the center of the service stood a striking gold-colored coffin. It became the final image of Harley Barbaro that would appear across newspapers and television screens throughout Australia. After the service, a solemn procession traveled to Mudjaraba Cemetery, where Harley was laid to rest for the public. It marked the end of a story that had filled headlines for years, for those who knew him. It was the loss of a partner, a father, a son, a friend. As the final motorcycles disappeared into the distance, one journey had come to an end, but the questions surrounding Harley Barbaro's life, and the legacy attached to his name, would continue long after the funeral was over. Harley Barbaro's story never had a simple ending. Born into a name that already carried decades of history, he spent the rest of his life creating a legacy that was entirely his own. To some, he will always be remembered as a Mongols Bikie. To others, he was a partner, a father, and someone whose private life was often overshadowed by public perception. Perhaps that is why his story continues to divide opinion, because the line between reputation and reality is rarely as clear as the headlines suggest. So what do you think? Was Harley Barbaro shaped by the legacy he inherited, or by the choices he made? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. If you enjoyed this documentary and want more carefully researched Australian true crime stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for future documentaries. This was the life and death of Harley Barbaro. Thanks for watching.